Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. Ever since I saw Walt Disney's 1951 classic Alice in Wonderland as a child, I have been utterly fascinated by the idea of size changing, a fairy tale old concept that has persisted well into modern times. While giant monster flicks were huge, no pun intended, in the mid-20th century, abnormal shrinkage was also eagerly explored and exploited in cinema. Fantastic Voyage, Attack of the Puppet People, Dr. Cyclops, The Phantom Planet, the list goes on. However, for all these filmmakers' albeit flimsy attempts to ground their plots in scientific reasoning and plausibility, this trope has generally been treated like either a grand adventure or a wacky dilemma, but little else. Be honest, would you willingly try to tame a spider the size of a bear? Presenting the strange, almost unbelievable story of The Incredible Shrinking Man. First published as a novel in 1956, then adapted to film in 1957, and recommended for audiences 16 and up. Scott Carey is an ordinary 6-foot-tall man on vacation when he is suddenly enveloped in a mist that vanishes as quickly as it comes. Aside from a strange glittering on his skin, nothing appears to be amiss, until his clothes begin to feel looser, and his wife Louise no longer has to stand on tiptoes in order to kiss him, and his wedding ring slips off his finger. Soon, the truth can't be denied. Scott is shrinking. First comes frustration as doctors struggle in vain to find a cure and his physical strength and social standing diminish with his size. Then humiliation as his lack of height labels him a freak in the eyes of his fellow man. Then rage as he becomes little more than a plaything at the mercy of towering giants. But these emotions pale against the terror of being mere inches tall. A run-in with a now monstrous animal traps him inside his cellar. And still he continues to shrink. Now a prisoner in the ever-expanding depths of his own house, Scott's daily fight for survival forces him to question his existence, his reality, and his very humanity as it threatens to disappear forever along with him. Author Richard Matheson, also famous for What Dreams May Come, A Stir of Echoes, and I Am Legend, was inspired to write his book, originally called simply The Shrinking Man, by a scene from the 1953 comedy Let's Do It Again, in which Gary accidentally puts on Frank's larger hat and it sinks below his ears. This prompted Matheson to wonder, what if a man put on his own hat and the same thing happened? While not as prolific, director Jack Arnold was a fine sci-fi master in his own right, best known, on top of Shrinking Man, for the classics It Came from Outer Space, Tarantula, and, one of the Universal monster greats, Creature from the Black Lagoon. One unique, if random, feature of the novel's nonlinear structure. Within the 17 chapters, pre-cellar flashbacks are subheaded with Scott's then height in inches, starting at 68 inches in Chapter 2 and ending at 7 inches in Chapter 15, when his entrapment is finally highlighted. The film, by contrast, presents the plot points in chronological order. Not quite as interesting, but certainly easier to follow in the long run. Being 1950s science fiction, even an Earthbound story wouldn't be the same without something to call alien. Matheson combines chillingly vivid prose with epic fantasy imagery, and lead actor Grant Williams gives a somber and haunting narration over well-made oversized props and ambitious but solid visual effects to turn ordinary living creatures into beasts of mythological proportions, and a common junk-filled cellar into a lonely, hostile world that this lone, tragic soul is condemned to traverse. Pages 4 through 8. The spider rushed at him across the shadowed sands, scrabbling wildly on its stalk-like legs. Its body was a giant glossy egg that trembled blackly as it charged across the windless mounds, its wake a score of sand-trickling scratches. Paralysis locked the man. He saw the poisonous glitter of the spider eyes. He watched it scramble across a log-like stick, body mounted high on its motion-blurred legs, as high as the man's shoulders. Behind him, suddenly, the steel-encased flame flared into life with a thunder that shook the air. It jarred the man loose. With a second gasp, he spun around and ran, the damp sand crunching beneath his racing sandals. The man dashed between the two giant cans that loomed like tanks above him. He threaded, racing, in between the silent bulks of all the clustered cans, past green and red and yellow sides all caked with livid smears. The great orange mass loomed over the man now as he headed once more for the edge of the cliff. There was no time for hesitation. With an extra springing of his legs, he flung himself across the gulf and clutched with spastic fingers at the roughened ledge. Wincing, he drew himself onto the splintered orange surface just as the spider reached the cliff's edge. Jumping up, the man began running along the narrow ledge, not looking back. He limped slowly past the silent steel tower, which was an oil burner, past the huge red serpent, which was a nozzleless garden hose clumsily coiled on the floor, past the white cushion whose case was covered with flower designs, past the immense orange structure, which was a stack of 2 wooden lawn chairs, past the great croquet mallets hanging in their racks. One of the wickets from the croquet set had been stuck in a groove on top of the lawn chair. It was what the man, in his flight, had grabbed for and missed. And the tank-like cans were used paint cans, and the spider was a black widow. He lived in a cellar. Countless sci-fi stories of this era were created when fears of radiation and nuclear war were fresh in Americans' minds, and Shrinking Man was no exception. But here, the sensational idea of shrinking is treated with surprisingly realistic, if Kafkaesque, care. Scott's condition is described as a sort of anti-cancer. Yet just like traditional cancer, after the initial shock wears off, the practical implications inevitably rear their ugly heads. Scott's worsening state means he can no longer be the breadwinner, leading to bills, and more bills. Fortunately, or not, there are plenty of healthy and insensitive parasites more than willing to milk such a fantastic sob story for all it's worth, a fact Scott must make use of for his family's sake, even as it erodes both his ego and his marriage. Pages 90 through 91. Days passed, one torture on another. Clothes were taken in for him. Furniture got bigger, less manageable. Beth and Lou got bigger. Financial worries got bigger. Scott, I hate to say it, but I don't see how we can go on much longer on $50 a week, with all of us to feed and clothe and house. Her voice trailed off. She shook her head in distress. I suppose you expect me to go back to the paper. I didn't say that. I merely said, I know what you said. Well, if it offends you, I'm sorry. $50 a week isn't enough. What about when winter comes? What about winter clothes and oil? He shook his head as if he were trying to shake away the need to think of it. Do you think Marty would... I can't ask Marty for more money, he said curtly. Well... She said no more. She didn't have to. Then, the last week in July, Marty's check didn't come. First they thought it was an oversight, but 2 more days went by, and the check still didn't come. We can't wait much longer, Scott, she said. What about the savings account? There isn't much more than $70 in it. Oh, well, we'll wait 1 more day, he said. He spent that day in the living room, staring at the same page of the book he was supposedly reading. He kept on telling himself he should go back to the Globe Post, let them continue their series, or accept one of the many offers for personal appearances, or let those lurid magazines write his story, or allow a ghostwriter to grind out a book about his case. Then there would be enough money. Then the insecurity that Lou feared so desperately would be ended. But telling himself about it wasn't enough. His revulsion against placing himself before the blatant curiosity of people was too strong. He comforted himself. The check will come tomorrow, he kept repeating. It'll come tomorrow. But it didn't. And that night they had driven over to Marty's, and Marty had told him that he had lost his contract with Fairchild and had to cut down operations to almost nothing. The checks would have to stop. He gave Scott $100, but that was the end. But the best subversion of expectations comes from the shrinking itself. In most other stories, extreme size reductions clock in at minutes, if not seconds. But Scott shrinks 1/7 of an inch per day. That's 1 inch per week, roughly 4 inches per month, and so on. Think how much more excruciating it is to shrink that slowly, to know firsthand the condescending looks and remarks, and have all the time in the world to be haunted by memories of a once normal past and fears of such an inconceivable future. What's more, long before the mortal danger of smallness, Scott suffers a sort of social de-evolution according to the 50s strict standards of masculinity. His weakness makes him womanly, his boy's clothes make him childlike, and his increasingly tyrannical attitude makes him inhuman. This metaphor is brilliantly illustrated through Scott's various horrible predicaments, most of which unfortunately aren't in the film, which I think severely weakens it in this regard. But thankfully, the film does include Scott's chance encounter with Clarice, a natural-born little person, who not only provides some much-needed intimacy and normalcy, however brief, but reminds him that, big or small, he is as human as anyone else. Page 148. She looked back at him a long moment. Then, without a word, she stepped close to him and laid her cheek against his. She stood quietly as he put his arms around her. "Oh," he whispered. "Oh, God. Too." She sobbed and pressed against him suddenly, her small hands catching at his back. Wordlessly they clung to each other in the quiet room, their tear-wet cheeks together. "My dear," she murmured. "My dear, my dear." He drew back his head and looked into her glistening eyes. "If you knew," he said brokenly. "If you—" "I do know," she said, running a trembling hand across his cheek. "Yes, of course you do." He leaned forward and felt her warm lips change under his from soft acceptance to a harsh, demanding hunger. He held her tensely. "Oh, God, to be a man again," he whispered. "Just to be a man again, to hold you like this." "Yes, do hold me. It's been so long." After a few minutes, Clarice led him to the couch and they sat there holding tightly to each other's hands, smiling at each other. Skipping to pages 156 to 157. Yes, he was still a man, 2/7 of an inch tall, and still a man. He remembered the night he'd been with Clarice, and how, then too, it had come to him that he was still a man. "You aren't pitiful," she whispered to him. "You're a man." She had dragged tense fingers across his chest. It had been a moment of decisive alteration. A man's self-estimation was, in the end, a matter of relativity, and he saw that size had changed nothing essential. He still had his mind. He was still unique. Vintage sci-fi fantasy horror stories, while entertaining for reasons both good and bad, so often lack real raw suspense and philosophical depth. The Incredible Shrinking Man may be as far-fetched in concept as aliens and giant monsters, but it is also much more pragmatic in presentation and therefore much more psychologically devastating in execution, making it a rare and rewarding exception to the rules of its campier contemporaries. Though not my personal definition of nightmare fuel, I can say that since experiencing the story, I have never looked at basements, or of course, spiders, in quite the same way as before. Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms, and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. It's not only because I enjoy stories as both an academic subject and a relaxing pastime that my frustration boils whenever I hear about schools cutting arts and music courses due to budget constraints. Bad enough such a move takes away opportunities to express oneself and to explore and/or challenge the real world through a more universal and imaginative lens. It implies that, on a professional, economic, and educational level, creative endeavors have less value and importance than practical skills, a sentiment I consider offensive as well as unhealthy, because I can say from years' worth of personal experience that cold hard facts and figures alone do not ensure real-world survival. It's been said that folktales are often based on some actual truth. That I do firmly believe. I also believe that such stories can even be prophecies in disguise, which, if taken to heart, can lead to life-changing miracles. Case in point, Grace Lynn's Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, first published in 2011 and recommended for readers 8 and up. For as long as little Min Li can remember, Fruitless Mountain is a name that has suited her home well. Each and every day, she, her parents, and her fellow villagers trudge and toil through mud and rock just to coax even the most meager grains of rice from the lifeless land, breaking their bodies and their spirits. Her only respite comes from the stories of enchantment and adventure her beloved father tells in the evening, despite her mother's bitter disapproval of such impractical things. But one night, in return for a kindness rendered to a talking goldfish, Min Li learns of the Old Man of the Moon, a mysterious being said to know the answer to every question in the world. And so, with the help of the many magical friends she meets and the many more fantastic tales they have to tell, Min Li sets out to learn how to bring the fruit back to Fruitless Mountain and change the fortune of her loved ones for the better. In spite of everything I said before, I do understand that even the most beautiful and meaningful stories are powerless if their young audience has no interest in listening. This is a sentiment that Lin, a Taiwanese American, shares in the Behind the Story section at the back of the book. Quote, I grew up as the only Asian in my elementary school classroom and one of the few minorities in my town, very much how it is written in my book, The Year of the Dog. By the time I was 11, I had fully disregarded my Asian heritage. My wise mother, knowing that any type of forced cultural exposure would lead to scorn, silently left half a dozen Chinese folktale and fairy tale books on the shelf. Unable to resist the pull of new books, I very quietly began to read them. At first I was disappointed. The translation from Chinese to English had left the stories completely thin and at times rough and hard to understand. There were hardly any details or descriptions, and the black and white illustrations were simple line drawings, a far cry from the lush paintings in my books of European fairy tales. I thought these Chinese stories had not made an impression on me, but I was wrong. As I grew older, I began to regret my childhood disinterest in my heritage. I visited Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China, and suddenly those stories came flooding back to me. In the land and architecture around me, the Chinese fairy tales seemed to come alive. Everything I saw brought back memories of those stories. End quote. As readers see via beautiful photos of her travels in Asia, Lin's desire to reconnect with her roots comes to life through her gorgeous full-color illustrations. I think that for her to have done them in black and white would have done her book a terrible disservice. Not only would such a choice have dimmed the beauty of the story itself, but readers would have been denied a taste of the vivid aesthetic of China. Her drawings have a calligraphic appearance, with graceful curves and refined angles, elegantly simple and yet richly detailed. For example, a photo of the humble administrator's garden, a popular attraction in Suzhou, near Shanghai, was the basis and backdrop for the palace garden in the City of Bright Moonlight, in which Min Li visits with the mysterious but kindly king, a full moon beautifully reflected in the leaf-laden pond. It is possible to enjoy this book even if you're not well versed in traditional Asian folktales, like admittedly myself. That said, there are specific narrative elements that I do recognize, which add some gratifying resonance to the reading. Early on, Min Li befriends a Chinese dragon who is actually a painting come to life. I was reminded of the animated Tales of the World episode, The Magic Paintbrush, a Chinese folktale in which a boy uses said brush to bring literal life to his own art. At another point, Min Li and Dragon must find a way past a bunch of greedy peach-hoarding monkeys. Here I can't help but think of Sun Wukong, aka the Monkey King, a central character in the 16th century Chinese novel, Journey to the West. There is one similar story that English speakers will be very familiar with. L. Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz. Besides the brave little girl journeying from her dull gray home into a whimsical world of color and self-discovery, you have friendly magical creatures the girl never dreamed existed, one of whom also becomes her traveling companion. I'd have to say that Dragon most closely resembles the Scarecrow. He goes by the name of what he actually is, and was technically created, not born. He must also be set free, having been tied up by the monkeys, when Min Li first meets him, and is convinced by her that his own problem, being unable to fly, could possibly be solved if he joins her to see an omniscient being of great power. He humbly claims not to be as worldly wise as his human friend, but his kindness, not his knowledge, is what she truly cares about. Pages 48 to 49. Why do you have to go through the forest? Min Li asked. Can't you just fly over? More tears, the size of lychee nuts, rolled down the dragon's face. I cannot fly, he sobbed. I do not know why. All other dragons can fly, but I cannot. I wish I knew why. Don't cry, Min Li said, patting the dragon, feeling more sorry for it than ever. I'm going to Never-Ending Mountain to see the Old Man of the Moon and ask him how to change my family's fortune. You can come too and ask him how to fly. You know where Never-Ending Mountain is? The dragon asked. I thought to see the Old Man of the Moon was impossible. You must be very wise to know how to find him. Not really, Min Li said. I got the directions from a goldfish. Skipping to pages 58 to 59. So you were born from a painting, Min Li said. That explains why you are so different from the dragons my father told me about. Your father knew other dragons? The dragon asked eagerly. I have never seen another dragon. I always thought if I could fly, I would finally see another like me. Well, Minli said. I don't think my father ever knew any dragons. He just told stories about them. Most people think dragons are just in stories. You are the only dragon I've ever met. Oh, the dragon said sadly. And I am not even a real dragon. All this time, Minli had been cutting the twine ropes. At that very moment, Minli cut the last rope and rubbed the dragon's arm. You are the only dragon I've ever met in real life, she said, and you feel real to me, so I think you're a real dragon, or at least real enough. Anyway, if we're going to Never-Ending Mountain together, let's at least be real friends. Yes, the dragon agreed, and they both smiled. But it's the side characters' own stories that really inspire, and would make a wonderful fairy tale collection in its own right. Initially, as much as Minli loves her father's stories with all her heart, they are also a source of guilt for her as they cause friction between her and her well-meaning but bitter mother, who constantly complains about their poverty and sees stories as worthless. Pages 24 to 25. So the old man of the moon was right, Minli said. Of course he was, Ba replied. The old man of the moon knows everything and can answer any question you ask. I should ask him how to bring fortune to our house, Minli said. He would know. I'll ask him. Where do I find him? They say he lives on top of Never-Ending Mountain, Ba said, but no one I have ever spoken to knows where that is. Maybe we can find out, Minli said. Oh, Minli, Ma said impatiently. Bringing fortune to our house, making Fruitless Mountain bloom? You're always wishing to do impossible things. Stop believing stories and stop wasting your time. Stories are not a waste of time, Ba said. Stories, Ma said, slapping her hands against the table, making the water in the fishbowl sway as she stood up and left the table, are what wasted money on this goldfish. Minli stared down at her rice bowl. The few white grains left sat like precious pearls at the bottom of her bowl. Ba patted her arm. Eat all your rice, daughter, he said, and with his shaking hands he scooped the last of his own rice to feed the fish. As Minli's quest progresses, however, the tales of those she meets prove to be increasingly important. One may present a riddle or mystery, like that of the village of the Moon Rain, for instance, which is solved by a different one later. Besides creatively fleshing out their respective narrators, they show how each of them are connected to one another, regardless of their walk of life, whether they themselves realize it or not. There's something else that makes these stories especially unique. Each of these short self-contained chronicles has a stylized title bordered by simple but lovely oriental designs. For each text, the traditional and rigid Times New Roman is traded for a more fluid and artistic font. I unfortunately wasn't able to determine which. These clever touches in the page's visual presentation tell readers they are about to enter another world and witness a new wonder even before the recitation begins. Pages 183 to 187. And as they approached the spot, Minli realized that the yellow was flowers. In front of them was land full of blooming trees. The trees were heavy with bright blossoms, and as the wind blew through the branches, golden flowers showered down like rain. That's our home, he told her. The village of the Moon Rain. Village of the Moon Rain? Minli asked. That's a strange name. Why isn't your village named after the flowering trees? It is, Dafu said. The story of the village of the Moon Rain. Over 100 years ago, when our ancestors were first brought here, the land of the village was barren and gray. Everything was dull and colorless, the wind cold and bitter. Still, our ancestors worked hard. They built houses out of the mountain stone, sewed warm wadded cotton jackets, and planted seeds in the hard dirt. But despite their efforts, the land refused to bear a single plant or flower. However, even though it looked hopeless, our ancestors continued to work. Then one night, when the moon was big and round, the air filled with a strange fluttering sound, our ancestors thought a great storm was coming and rushed inside. and a great storm was coming. With a crash, raindrops seemed to fall from the sky. But what a strange rain it was. Round and smooth, in the glowing light, the raindrops looked like silver pearls. And when they touched the ground, they disappeared. "It's raining pearls," our ancestors said to each other. "Jewels from the moon." And they rushed out with baskets and bags, catching what they could from this strange storm. Magically, when the raindrops were caught, they didn't disappear, and soon their baskets and bags were full. But in the morning, our ancestors saw that the drops were not pearls or jewels. In the sunlight, they saw that they were really seeds, but no one knew what kind of seeds they were. Curious, they planted them in the hard earth. And when the moon rose again that night, the strange rain fell again as well. This time our ancestors were not fooled and just watched the drops disappear into the ground. But in the morning, the planted seeds were sprouting as if watered by a magic brew. So night after night, the seed rain fell from the sky. And as daylight broke over the land, the seedlings grew higher. Soon they grew into beautiful silver trees with golden flowers. They were so beautiful, our ancestors planted more and more seeds, and soon the whole village was blooming with hundreds and hundreds of flowering trees. And since then, our home has been called the Village of the Moon Rain. We plant new seeds every day, and every night the moon rain falls, and every morning a new seedling sprouts. Maybe in another 100 years, all this stony land will be covered with trees, and the mountain will be as golden as the moon. Sometimes it's only later in life that one comes to appreciate the tales that had not only shaped one's outlook, but helped to establish one's roots and sense of identity in a world so often dreary and chaotic. What began as a storyteller's way to explore and pay homage to our ancestral past blossomed into a stunning adventure for young readers, all the more magical for being inspired by a celebrated real-world culture. Like the celestial body in its title, where the mountain meets the moon is sure to brighten the imagination and shed light on stories not as far beyond the realm of possibility as they may appear. Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. The first day of my children's media class at LSC is one that I won't soon forget. Upon receiving my syllabus, I had to blink a few times at a particular book on my list, Carrie by Stephen King. Is this for real? I wondered. My classmates' expressions told me they were having similar thoughts. Amused at our collective confusion, our professor simply said, "I know what you're all thinking, and I promise it will make sense." Turns out, he was right. Instead of focusing on the horror, try reading Carrie with classic fairy tales and their common tropes and symbols in mind, particularly Cinderella. You'll be amazed, trust me. One of the most prominent questions our professor had us consider throughout the course was, what makes a story for children? If you've seen, quote, kids' movies like Labyrinth and Watership Down as I had to in class, you'll understand what a conundrum this actually was. This movie was no easier to categorize. The cover art alone makes the 1976 Carrie movie look like a real fairy tale, albeit a very dark one. Let's rendezvous with the offbeat, courtesy of The Triplets of Belleville, released in 2003 and rated PG-13 for some sensuality, violence, and crude humor. Madame Souza spends her days in a little house in the French countryside raising her orphan grandson, Champion, who has an insatiable passion for cycling. Ever the devoted grandmother, she takes it upon herself to be his coach and train him for the prestigious Tour de France. During the great bike race, however, Champion is kidnapped by black-clad mafia henchmen to be a pawn in their underground gambling ring. Souza pursues them all the way across the Atlantic, only to lose them in the bustling city of Belleville. Fortunately, some improv percussion on a busted bike wheel attracts the attention and aid of Rose, Violet, and Blanche, 3 singing, swinging sisters known in the music hall world as the Triplets of Belleville. With the triplets' flair and street smarts, and her stubbornness and obese family dog Bruno on her side, Souza determines to take on as many mini mob bosses and giant gun-toting goons as necessary in order to rescue Champion. In the American theatrical trailer, A.O. Scott of the New York Times called Sylvain Chomet's film, quote, a far cry from either Walt Disney or Japanese anime. He couldn't be more right, for many reasons. The Triplets of Belleville has the honor of being the first PG-13 film to receive an Academy Award nomination for Best Animated Feature. It lost. Surprise, surprise. Still, how could it not stick out like a sore thumb against more conventional fare like Finding Nemo or Brother Bear? And sore may very well be an apt word for this. Here are some of the most grotesque character designs I have ever seen, and I for one couldn't be more fascinated. From gargantuan girths and scraggly limbs to bulging teeth and flabby skin, virtually every figure and feature has been deliberately and immensely exaggerated to be humorous and discomforting in equal measure. There is a 1513 painting by Flemish artist Quentin Matsis called The Ugly Duchess, said to have inspired John Tenniel's original illustration of the Duchess in Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. It shows an old woman in exquisite attire, but who herself is wrinkled, square-jawed, and has withered breasts, a sort of parody of traditional feminine beauty. That more or less sums up the unlikely heroines in this wonderland of caricatures. No pretty Disney princesses or sexy anime warriors here. Madame Souza is as short and stout as a teapot, with thick glasses that magnify her irises to comical proportions and a single platform boot for an apparent leg-length discrepancy. And then there are the triplets, tall in height but stooped in back, their wizened faces sagging so heavily it looks like it takes effort just to move their features. But what they may lack in aesthetic appearance, they make up for with their pluck and charm. This is actually crucial since the film contains virtually no spoken dialogue, the story told instead through pantomime, a type of stage theater in which the performers express meaning through gestures and songs. I find this artistic choice appropriate considering it can also refer to a ridiculous or confusing situation, an apt description for this movie's vibe. More on that later. What few lines do exist, TV, radio, etc., are for setting an atmosphere rather than plot, a plus for viewers who may dislike foreign films because of distracting subtitles. Souza herself speaks a grand total of twice, and never on screen, but no more than that is needed to show her sweet side. When she tries to bond with Champion as a child while watching TV, and then when she innocently but spectacularly fails to entertain her musical hostesses on their piano. But through her silence, she exudes the kind of doggedness only a little old lady could pull off, whether she is habitually shoving her glasses up on her face with a firm finger before every important task, or keeping incessant pace with her coach whistle during every cycling trip. The triplets are just as delightful to watch and to hear, 3 1930s jazz counterparts to the Sister Act nuns. Their voices may be cracked and dusty, and their glory days on the stage long gone, but their expert musical ears, boundless vigor, and upbeat attitudes keep them forever young and forever endearing. All that said, Souza and the triplets are a lot more human than the rest of the cast, in every sense of the word. Champion is like a strange hybrid of man and racehorse, with huge docile eyes, a stretched nose, bulging leg muscles, footsteps that clip-clop like hooves, and seemingly limitless stamina that gives new meaning to the term horsepower. But he is also broken in like a horse, putting up no fight whatsoever against any handlers, and instead tamely following wherever he's led with soft nickers and whinnies. The bad guys make almost no sound at all. I think partly to make them more intimidating, but mostly, with their design, I think for them to do so might make them even weirder. The animators take the stereotype of 10-foot subordinates serving a less than 1-foot-tall boss a comedic step further, by building the former like the unnaturally rectangular monoliths from 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the thick mustache bulbous-nosed superior like the Mario Brothers' drunk, narcoleptic uncle, his head sleepily flopped on every flat surface in front of him. Though like Champion, the Mafia's tiny mechanic has some animal in him too. In this case, a mouse, possessing large round ears and buck teeth, and expressing himself through nothing but cute little squeaks. Complementing the bizarre visual style is the classic Looney Tunes sense of humor, which I think is just as smart. Take Belleville itself for an example. A combination of the world's most prominent cities, Paris, New York City, Montreal, and Quebec, Belleville is a satire of extreme consumerism, with morbid obesity rampant among not only the background characters, but even certain inanimate icons, like the very well-fed Statue of Liberty, holding an ice cream cone and a cheeseburger on a plate instead of a torch and tabula and sada, and the much stockier Oscar statuettes lining the Triplets' shelves. And remember how Looney Tunes would often lampoon mid-20th century celebrities like Humphrey Bogart, Frank Sinatra, and Jimmy Durante? Well, the opening sequence does just that. While the Triplets in their younger days perform on an old variety show, we see some rather risque Fleischer-esque parodies of Romani French jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt, black French entertainer Josephine Baker, and American dancer Fred Astaire. Although, the film's grungier palette and comparative realism tends to make such humor more objectively insane. One of my favorite scenes of this kind is when Blanche treks to a pond, tosses a live shaft grenade into the water, and cheerfully waits under her umbrella for the exploding geyser to send a rain of dead frogs plopping into her fishing net for her to take to her sisters to cook for dinner. And I don't know whether or not this was intentional, but I also like how the filmmakers don't just play with certain stereotypes, but mold and squash and tease them until they are as hilariously odd as the heroines. Besides the Triplets, being French, eating literally nothing but frogs, hence the extreme hunting method, they also make clever use of household items traditionally associated with stay-at-home women. During the climax, Rose's frying pan makes a great weapon for bashing baddies unconscious and shielding against flying bullets. But perhaps the best example is the restaurant scene in which the Triplets perform a very unique musical number with a newspaper, a refrigerator's steel rungs, and an old vacuum cleaner, the last of which the animators, according to the DVD commentary, had affectionately named Moof Moof. Fantasy horror writer Clive Barker once said regarding pantomime, quote, "In truth, there is much in the form I admire. Its artlessness, for one. Its riotous indifference to any rules of drama but its own. Its guileless desire to delight. And of course, beneath all its tarnished ways, there is buried a story of primal simplicity. Good against evil, love triumphing over hate and envy." A perfectly ironic, yet ironically perfect description of this movie. At its core, The Triplets of Belleville is a familial search and rescue story, and the creators could have stopped at the already funny twist of the old grandmother saving the young adult grandson rather than vice versa. But the sheer absurdity of its characters, its eccentric soundtrack, and tongue-in-cheek wit turn a potentially dull and off-putting presentation into a joyride as exceptional as it is farcical. Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. On my 8th Christmas morning, my little sister and I each received from our mother a VHS movie featuring a single TV episode of two very different cartoons. For her, The Berenstain Bears and The Messy Room, and for me, 25 of the most terrifying minutes I had ever seen in fiction up to then. Like Poltergeist, Exorcist, Ring kind of terrifying. Of course, the effects have long since been dulled, but here's the real kicker. Later on as an adult, I looked up the cartoon on Wikipedia just for fun and found the listing of the infamous episode in question, entitled The Invisible Monster. This is how its description ends. Quote, "Note, this episode is generally remembered as the most frightening one in the series." End quote. I swear, I had not laughed so loud and so hard in a long, long time. Presenting Jonny Quest, first airing from 1964 to 1965, with two sequel series, The New Adventures of Jonny Quest from 1986 to 1987, and The Real Adventures of Jonny Quest from 1996 to 1997, and recommended for viewers 12 and up. On the surface, Jonny Quest is your typical American kid, but his life is far from typical. His father is Dr. Benton Quest, a brilliant scientist whose life's mission, besides caring for his only son, is to use his research for world peace. But Jonny is in constant danger from enemies who would use him to compromise or exploit Dr. Quest's work. Luckily, they are not alone. With them is Race Bannon, the Quest's strong and steadfast bodyguard, Haji Singh, Johnny's adopted Indian brother and closest companion, Race's equally adventurous and intellectual daughter, Jessie, and the Quest's playful but fierce dog, Bandit. Together, the team travels the globe, seeking priceless artifacts, creating experimental devices, and studying mysterious phenomena, protecting them and each other from any who desire world domination and destruction. Not unlike Walt Disney's Gargoyles in the mid-1990s, the franchise's first series, Jonny Quest, was animation juggernaut Hanna-Barbera's first foray into the action-adventure genre, after the studio had established itself with comedic cartoons like the Flintstones, Yogi Bear, and the Jetsons. When comic book artist Doug Wildey was hired to design an animated TV adaptation of the 1930s radio drama Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, Hanna-Barbera couldn't obtain the rights, so Wildey borrowed its core elements to create an original story. But Jack still has a small place in the Quest legacy. In the opening shots of Jonny Quest's end credit sequence, the two figures escaping the African warriors via hovercraft are actually Jack Armstrong and his friend Billy Fairfield. Not only would Jonny Quest pave the way for more action fare from Hanna-Barbera, like Space Ghost, The Herculoids, and Birdman, it would inspire many parodies and crossovers, the best known of the former being the Adult Swim series, The Venture Brothers. I was too young to remember watching much of the 60s series other than my VHS tape, but I think my later taste in older science fiction has helped me better understand and appreciate its presentation. Though it utilizes the same limited animation as the slapstick cartoons that came before it, I think it complements rather than cheapens the authentically detailed, thick-line action comic book design. Its episode titles and title cards resemble the beautiful handcrafted sci-fi movie posters of old, like The Mystery of the Lizard Men, The Dreadful Doll, and the aforementioned The Invisible Monster. And also like vintage sci-fi flicks, the episodes are a lot more fun than the generic names would have you believe. Racially insensitive though it may be by today's standards, with its often stereotypical depiction of foreign enemies and indigenous cultures, it's still a fascinating time capsule of the Cold War era, illustrating the values and consequences of scientific progress behind the riveting exploits of a kid's action cartoon. I knew nothing of New Adventures as a kid, but having watched it now, it neither emulated the original enough to feel nostalgic, nor updated it enough to make it unique. The Real Adventure series is the one I'm most familiar with, as I watched it on Cartoon Network's Toonami block. This revival brought its protagonist to his teen years and its franchise into the newly evolving internet age. One nice subtle touch is its use of OCRA, an electronic font developed in 1968 to be recognized by both early computers and humans. More prominent is the addition of 3D animation via Quest World, a computer program which allows the heroes to enter cyberspace as virtual avatars. The unrefined CGI is nowhere near Code Lyoko or even reboot quality due to time and budget, but that's made up for with modernized threats like cyber-terrorism, nuclear warfare, and even paranormal activity to raise the stakes, making this show as much an upgrade as an update. These and other features make comparing and contrasting the original and revival an interesting exercise in story critique and analysis. Whereas the former's futuristic espionage look and tone remain consistent, the latter's troubled production history and many staffing changes during its run resulted in its two seasons looking and feeling as different from each other as they both do from their 60s counterpart. Real Adventure Season 1 revamped the characters with more believable qualities and wrote more plausible plotlines based on documented phenomena, like ancient history or cryptozoology, such as the Jersey Devil and the Revolutionary War in The Spectre of Pine Barrens. Season 2, on the other hand, brought the characters back to their 60s roots, while, rather ironically, delving into more supernatural territory, aliens, demons, ghosts, etc., like in another episode I personally found very chilling, The Mummies of Malinke. While not objectively bad, this can make for a somewhat jarring viewing experience. Thankfully, the main character stayed the same where it matters most. Jonny is as bold as his name with a spirit to match. He has a boundless curiosity, competitive spirit, and mischievous streak, playing harmless pranks on his family and not so harmless ones on the villains, but he never comes off as annoying or obnoxious. While not as scientific as his father, preferring to be in the thick of the action and using his keen intuition to stay out of trouble, Jonny cares for him deeply, along with any good soul he comes across, human or otherwise. Dr. Quest has a very kingly demeanor. dignified and firm, but benevolent and patient. He is never focused on his work to the point of obsession or negligence, nor does his thirst for knowledge close his mind to myth and legend in favor of facts, or motivate him to exploit them for personal gain. He may be a top U.S. government scientist, but he is first and foremost a loving parent and a good man, the lives of others worth more to him than all the wisdom on the planet. Race, a former special agent, protects the Quest team and especially Jonny. Quote, 24 hours a day as tutor, companion, and all-around watchdog. End quote. Race underwent the most striking alterations out of the cast from one show and season to the next, compared to his near-identical depictions in the original and Real Adventure Season 2. In Season 1, he looks younger and lankier, with an almost distracting southern accent and a patent for witty, if corny, cowboy quips. He is well-versed in judo and various kinds of weapons and vehicles. While he performs his duty with the utmost seriousness, he is treated by his charges less like an employee and more like a member of their family, acting as Dr. Quest's most trusted confidant and a father figure to the kids, with level-headedness, some dry humor, and grit. Haji joins the team after saving Dr. Quest from an assassin's dagger. His introspective mysticism balances out the story's otherwise strict science, and he serves as the voice of reason to his age-mate's impulsiveness, often speaking in proverbs and riddles, many of which go over their heads. Depending on version, he is proficient in tricks like snake charming, levitation, and telekinesis, or in actual yogi abilities like slowing his breathing to simulate death. His devotion to his own faith and culture is matched only by his love for his American family. Jessie was a late but invaluable addition to the franchise. The first version of her, with a different backstory, appeared in the New Adventures episode Deadly Junket, but rarely again until after she became a permanent fixture in Real Adventures. But she is no mere token female. Though the most academic of the young trio, she has a deep and earnest reverence for the world's splendor that goes beyond mere study. She also shares the boys' love of exploration and courage to face impossible odds for the sake of what's right. The Quest bulldog, Bandit, is so named due to the black mask-like markings around his eyes. Unlike most of Hanna-Barbera's animal characters, Bandit is a natural, non-anthropomorphic dog. That said, in the first show he is the comic relief, showing human expressions and intelligence, and his curiosity, even greater than Jonny's, often getting him into adorable mishaps. These cartoonish features were toned down in the revival to make him even more realistic. Nevertheless, he saves his human friends countless times, as any brave and loyal dog does. Regardless of the show or decade, I can imagine many a kid and adult finding the protagonist's likability, relatability, and overall confidence and inner strength just as appealing as the adrenaline-fueled adventures and exotic locales he and his comrades encounter. Whether you like a good old-fashioned sci-fi B-movie or a modern technological thriller, Jonny Quest wraps up all the size and scope of both in a nice, neat little after-school package. Gather around next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. It sometimes saddens me that America, being such a comparatively young nation, doesn't have its own mythology the way other older cultures do. Sure, we have our tall tales, Paul Bunyan, Johnny Appleseed, John Henry, and the like, but I wouldn't go so far as to place Darth Vader, Yoda, Batman, Superman, and Spider-Man on the same pedestal as Zeus, Odin, Shiva, Anubis, and Kukulkan. With all due respect to the former, and despite their wild popularity and influence, I think it may be because they feel too modern and commercialized to me. True mythological figures, in my mind, are ancient and omniscient forces of nature, not only providing supposed explanations for why the world is the way it is now, but existing in a dreamlike time and space beyond mankind's reach and earthly comprehension. Thus it is particularly enlightening to experience a mythological story expressed from the heart of its own native country, even if, or maybe especially when, it's done via contemporary means. Here is the epic story of Son of the White Mare, First released in 1981 and recommended for viewers 16 and up. A beautiful white mare goddess races for her life through a dark forest as her once glorious realm falls. Just as the evil minions in pursuit are about to claim her, the mare finds safe haven within a mighty hollow tree. It is here that she gives birth to a human boy, Tree Shaker, who gains his godly strength from his mother's milk. As he grows to manhood, the mare tells her son the story of the Sky King and Snow Queen, and their 3 princely sons who married 3 fairy princess sisters, Autumn Fair, Spring Fair, and Summer Fair. All would have been happy and prosperous had the curious sisters not opened the one door forbidden to them. The 3 evil dragons, now freed, immediately captured the princesses, killed the princes, overthrew the king, and imprisoned the queen. The queen bore 2 sons who disappeared. While pregnant with a 3rd child, she escaped, in the form of a white mare. Understanding his birthright and his purpose, Tree Shaker sets out to reunite with his long-lost brothers, Stone Crumbler and Iron Temperer, and with them, journey into the underworld in order to defeat the dragons, reclaim their brides, and restore their kingdom. The plot of White Mare is based on the 1862 Hungarian folktale Fehér by Laszlo Arányi, with director Marcel Jankovics giving at the beginning a dedication to, quote, the Scythians, Huns, Avars, and other nomadic peoples, end quote. Though Jankovics had wanted to make a fairy tale movie from the start, his original vision couldn't be realized due to the political tensions prevalent in the Cold War Eastern Europe in which he grew up. According to animation historian Charles Solomon in the Blu-ray's booklet, quote, a scholar of mythology and symbolism, Jankovics initially planned to meld several folktales into a feature that would explore the cycles of time and space. But according to Marxist theory, time is irreversible. A film that focused on the recurring cycles that characterize many myths could be perceived as anti-Marxist by the Soviet-dominated government. Instead, Jankovics turned to The Son of the White Mare, an oral epic of Central Asia that was brought to Europe by the early Hungarians. Like all folktales, it exists in multiple versions. More than 50 variations have been collected by scholars in the Carpathian Basin, and the filmmaker drew elements from a half-dozen accounts of the story. End quote. For unknown reasons, the film wasn't distributed in America upon release. Very strange, not to mention downright devastating, considering the factors that would have worked in its favor. Number 1. Jankovics had already proven himself an animation pioneer beforehand, having directed the very first Hungarian animated feature film, Johnny Corncob, in 1973, and following with the Oscar-nominated short, Sisyphus, in 1974. Number 2. Disney was in the middle of its Bronze Era, struggling due to its namesake's passing in 1966. Number 3. Aside from the syndication of Astro Boy, anime hadn't yet made its mark in the West. And number 4. Very few other Western animated feature films made prior were remotely comparable to it, some exceptions including Fantasia, Fantastic Planet, and Yellow Submarine. Still, White Mare did find success, being placed at number 49 on the Olympiad of Animation in 1984 and premiering at the Los Angeles International Animation Celebration in 1985. Then, in 2019, LA studio Arbalos Films and the Hungarian Film Institute gave the movie a stunning 4K restoration, screening it at the 2019 Fantasia International Film Festival and planning a long overdue theatrical release in the US soon after. This plan was unfortunately shelved in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, so White Mare was instead made available to stream in America through Vimeo in late 2020 and then released on Blu-ray in 2021. The brave hero rescues damsel in distress from evil monsters plot is pretty basic and antiquated on paper, but Jankovics makes it stand out by giving it a phantasmagoric 20th century coat of paint in every sense of the term. White Mare's production and design was heavily influenced by the psychedelic drug culture of the 60s, resulting in a piece meant to stun the senses and mystify the mind as well as entertain the eyes. The music alone speaks volumes, pun intended, of the alien world viewers are about to enter. Though the electronic soundtrack may seem better suited for equally surreal but more contemporarily based movies like Labyrinth, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, or 2001: A Space Odyssey, the synthesized ambience fits the mythological setting. dreamy and nightmarish all at once, completely transcendent of time, space, and all things mortal. I think where Jankovic is at his most creative and clever is how he reimagines and enhances the story's traditional fairy tale tropes and symbols with his own unique artistic nuances, namely his highly abstract design and heavy emphasis on vivid colors and symmetrical shapes. This is best portrayed by the three brothers, who are kinda like the incarnation of the Goldilocks concept of too hot, too cold, and just right, as is so with their polar opposite brides and their adversaries, who, by the way, are not dragons in the traditional sense. I think of them more like golems myself, but that's just me. Stone Crumbler, the firstborn, is colored in shades of coppery red with lots of teardrop-shaped curves, some more flattering than others. Such a design, I believe, fits his personality as a careless, hot-headed bumbler, slow in words and wit, with more rocks in his head than in his hands. These traits contrast the vain and sensual nature of his lusty, and I dare say busty, destined bride, Autumn Fair, while paralleling the three-headed dragon, a crude and boorish oaf made of stone. Iron Temperer, the middle brother, is a bit more competent than Stone Crumbler, though not by much. His triangular, silvery blue form represents an arrogance as cold and hard as the metal he molds like clay. His brashness is balanced out by his very needy and very whiny betrothed, Springfair, and her captor, the seven-headed dragon, matches his aggression via the personification of war, a fully armed tank. No, I am not making that up. And then there is Tree Shaker, the youngest, and therefore the kindest, bravest, and overall best, as is visually apparent from his hues of golden yellow and the sun-like spheres adorning his face. Some of his attractiveness is more subtle, his name and special ability symbolizing nature and life, as opposed to his brother's inorganic mineral names, as well as his modesty, as Stone Crumbler goes shirtless and Iron Temperer's smock covers only his front. Likewise, Tree Shaker's beloved, Summerfair, is more reserved and dignified than her sisters, and his enemy, the 12-headed dragon, though his pixelated skyscraper form makes him look like a boss from a vintage Atari game, is nevertheless more terrifying and powerful than his brothers because of his intelligence and foresight. Yet in spite of these obvious differences, I love the artistic touches which illustrate the warriors' brotherly bond. Many shots cut or dissolve from one brother to another in such a way as to give the illusion that they are morphing into one another, while others show the circular ground rotating beneath them as they walk, as if their godly motion is what moves their entire world. And in one of the film's most beautiful sequences, before beginning their journey, the trio swears their undying loyalty to each other by grasping hands around Iron Temperer's triangular club. Their linked arms dissolve into a flowing braid-like design as it rotates clockwise. The sides of the club multiply, changing it into a 12-pointed sun, which in turn transforms into the brothers' divine faces. It's movies like this that make both foreign animation and film as an art form so enthralling to me, not to mention remind me of the majesty and real-world significance of folklore. Jankovic not only turns what would otherwise be a very basic and cliched story into a kaleidoscopic powerhouse of epic fantasy, but does so without diminishing its universal qualities or disparaging its noble heritage. I hope that many more hidden cinematic gems are found and polished so that they may be given the admiration this cosmic jewel was once so sadly denied. Gather around next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. November is an important month in the writing community, for it is National Novel Writing Month, better known as NaNoWriMo. The basic goal is to write or begin writing a 50,000-word manuscript within 1 month. What began as a small writing project in 1999 is now a full-fledged nonprofit organization designed to encourage creative writing and provide various resources for aspiring authors. Charitable work aside, I'm personally glad that the project's timing was moved from July to November, as writing is a good activity for not-so-good weather. This fantasy novel, completed by its author in a span of 3 NaNoWriMos, is likewise an excellent story to while away those dreary days of gray, or to complement them, as the case may be. Let us all now go and see Erin Morgenstern's The Night Circus, first published in 2012 and recommended for readers 16 and up. To the untrained eye, Le Cirque de Rêve, the Circus of Dreams, may be the most unusual circus ever to come to town. It has no schedule, is only open from sunset to sunrise, and, rather than the traditional kaleidoscope of color in one large tent, offers many small tents of black, white, and all non-colors in between. What few realize, however, is how magical it truly is. The circus, in reality, is the setting for a fantastic duel between 2 powerful prodigies, Celia Bowen, daughter of the arrogant stage magician Prospero the Enchanter, and Marco Alastair, the orphaned ward of the enigmatic man in the gray suit. Trained since childhood in the vastly different ways of their volatile masters, Celia and Marco pit their magical skills against one another under the guise of creating ever more elaborate delights to dazzle the paying public. But when the devoted rivals become star-crossed lovers, the resulting chain of events endangers patron and performer alike. Now Celia and Marco must find a way to end the increasingly deadly contest without destroying not only each other, but the innocent souls for whom the circus provides far more than mere entertainment. Fairy tale for adults is often the go-to description for darker, more mature works of fantasy. The Night Circus is no exception, but due to the constant evolution of fairy tales, the term nowadays can mean quite literally anything. And yet, that very idea lays at the heart of this story, more specifically, the nature of dreams. I believe Morgenstern makes this very clear even through her narrative structure. The book is non-linear and entirely in present tense, symbolizing a dream's immediacy and freedom from the constraints of time. Chapters are written in third-person limited, with brief second-person segments in between. Besides allowing readers to witness the circus through the myriad characters' own eyes and experience it as patrons themselves, these choices in POV emulate a dream's limitless potential as well as its lack of concrete form and definition. The fairy tales of old weren't known for being very complicated. Much of this book is the same way. It's never explained how or why the main characters are capable of what is essentially sorcery, conjuring attractions like the Ice Garden and the Cloud Maze, which are just as literal as they are stunning. Many aspects like these are described in a way that expects the reader to accept them at face value, not unlike how we accept even the strangest dreams when we sleep. But Morgenstern maintains authentic complexity and intrigue with the tried and true approach of leaving certain things to the imagination and focusing instead on the reactions of those on the outside. These rêveurs, or dreamers as they call themselves, dress in black and white to blend in with the monochrome illusions, but with a dash of red as a symbol of their real human hearts. This is an attractive image that not only fits the Victorian setting, but distinguishes these patrons as individuals seeking camaraderie and purpose through the experiencing and sharing of dreams, as opposed to just obsessed fans. A prime example is Bailey Clark, a lonely farm boy torn between personal happiness and familial loyalty. At the circus, he meets twin performers, Poppet and her brother Widget. Despite their uncanny precognitive abilities, or perhaps because of them, the empathetic and easygoing siblings, the lovely Poppet in particular, not only become the best friends Bailey's ever had, but give him the courage and wisdom to forge his own future. By the way, Bailey? Barnum and Bailey? Coincidence? Page 258. So you see everything before it happens? Bailey asks. He is not sure Poppet's answer is entirely what he expected, if he expected anything at all. Poppet shakes her head. No, not everything. Sometimes just bits of things like words and pictures in a book, but the book has lots of pages missing and it's been dropped in a pond and some parts are blurry but other parts aren't. Does that make sense? She asks. Not really, Bailey answers. Poppet laughs. I know it's strange, she says. No, it's not, Bailey says. Poppet turns to look at him, the skepticism at the statement evident on her face. Well, yes, it is kind of strange, but just odd strange, not bad strange. Thank you, Bailey, Poppet says. skipping to pages 268 to 269. It seems a lifetime ago that he walked to the circus, though it was only a few hours. And more than that, it feels as though the Bailey who entered the circus was an entirely different person than the one leaving it now, with a silver ticket in his pocket. He wonders which is the real Bailey, for certainly the Bailey who spent hours in trees alone is not the Bailey who is granted special admission to a spectacular circus, who makes friends with such interesting people without even trying. By the time he reaches the farm, he is sure that the Bailey he is now is closer to the Bailey he is supposed to be than the Bailey he had been the day before. He may not be certain what any of it means, but for now he does not think it much matters. In his dreams, he is a knight on horseback, carrying a silver sword, and it does not really seem that strange after all. And yet this endeavor is anything but a fairy tale to our main protagonists, whose upbringings, though literally enchanted, more resemble, respectively, those of Cinderella at the mercy of her evil stepmother and Rapunzel isolated in her tower. Prospero's cruel training, which includes physically abusing Celia so she can practice healing her wounds with magic, strengthens her will as well as her power, but also leaves her heartbroken and bitter. Marco is given almost no guidance or context in his lessons by his less detestable but more detached master, being expected to learn for himself when outside, but otherwise left home to study on his own, resulting in a cold and empty existence. This makes their private meetings as adults all the more satisfying, because of the subtle defiance they show via the attractions they create as the most romantic gifts with the very same powers they are supposed to be using against each other. Pages 343 to 348. The striped canvas sides of the tent stiffen, the soft surface hardening as the fabric changes to paper. Words appear over the walls, typeset letters overlapping handwritten text. Celia can make out snatches of Shakespearean sonnets and fragments of hymns to Greek goddesses as the poetry fills the tent. It covers the walls and the ceiling and spreads out over the floor. And then the tent begins to open, the paper folding and tearing. The black stripes stretch out into empty space as their white counterparts brighten, reaching upward and breaking apart into branches. "Do you like it?" Marco asks, once the movement settles and they stand within a darkened forest of softly glowing, poem-covered trees. Celia can only nod. He reluctantly releases her, following as she walks through the trees, reading bits of verse on branches and trunks. "How do you come up with such images?" she asks, placing her hand over the layered paper bark of one of the trees. It is warm and solid beneath her fingers, illuminated from within like a lantern. "I see things in my mind," Marco says. "In my dreams. I imagine what you might like." "I don't think you're meant to be imagining how to please your opponent," Celia says. "I have never fully grasped the rules of the game, so I am following my instincts instead," Marco says. He turns to the crimson tree and it glows brighter, the red of embers shifting to the bright warmth of fire. The surrounding trees follow suit. As the light from the trees increases, it becomes so bright that Celia closes her eyes. The ground beneath her feet shifts, suddenly unsteady, but Marco puts a hand on her waist to keep her upright. When she opens her eyes, they are standing on the quarterdeck of a ship in the middle of the ocean. Only the ship is made of books. It sails thousands of overlapping pages, and the sea it floats upon is dark black ink. Tiny lights hang across the sky, like tightly packed stars bright as sun. "I thought something vast would be nice, after all the talk of confined spaces," Marco says. Celia walks to the edge of the deck, running her hands along the spines of the books that form the rail. A soft breeze plays with her hair, bringing with it the mingling scent of dusty tomes and damp, rich ink. Marco comes and stands next to her as she looks at the midnight sea that stretches out into a clear horizon with no land in sight. Part of what makes Celia and Marco's relationship so tragic is the fact that they are inextricably bound by magic to compete whether they want to or not, and in that way must remain together without ever truly being able to be together. nor are they the only ones paying the price. They've developed a bond with the professionals without whom the circus would never become the success it is. A strong affection that the unfeeling Prospero and man in the gray suit neither understand nor care about. The knowledge that they all have essentially been toying with the lives of them and other outsiders blissfully unaware of the circus's origin and true agenda weighs heavily on the couple's consciences. It is their human love and desire to use their powers to end such cruelty without ending the innocent joy of the circus itself that lends them a true godlike quality. Pages 291 to 293. They walk through the moonlit ballroom, their steps echoing together. "How is Chandresh?" Celia asks, attempting to find a subject to fill the silence, anything to distract herself from her still shaking hands, and remembering the fallen glass at dinner. "He wavers," Margot says with a sigh. "Ever since the circus opened, he's been increasingly unfocused. I do what I can to keep him steady, though I fear it has an adverse effect on his memory. I had not intended to, but after what happened with the late Miss Burgess, I thought it the wisest course of action." She was in the peculiar position of being involved in all this, but not within the circus itself, Celia says. "I am sure it is not the easiest perspective to manage. At least you can observe Chandresh." "Indeed," Margot says. "I do wish there was a way to protect those outside the circus the way the bonfire protects those within it." "The bonfire?" Celia asks. "It serves several purposes. Primarily, it is my connection to the circus, but it also functions as a safeguard of a sort. I neglected the fact that it does not cover those outside the fence." "I neglected even considering safeguards," Celia says. "I do not think I understood at first how many other people would become involved in our challenge." She stops walking, standing in the middle of the ballroom. Margot stops as well, but says nothing, waiting for her to speak. "It was not your fault," she says quietly. "What happened to Tara? The circumstances may have played out the same way regardless of anything you or I did. You could not take away anyone's own free will. That was one of my very first lessons." Margot nods, and then he takes a step closer to her. He reaches out to take her hand, slowly brushing his fingers against hers. The feeling is as strong as it had been when he touched her before, but something is different. The air changes, but the chandeliers hanging above them remain steady and still. "What are you doing?" she asks. "You mentioned something about energy," Margot says. "I'm focusing yours with mine, so you won't break the chandeliers." "If I broke anything, I could probably fix it," Celia says, but she does not let go. Without the concern for the effect she might be having on the surroundings, she is able to relax into the sensation instead of resisting it. It is exquisite. It is the way she has felt in so many of his tents, the thrill of being surrounded by something wondrous and fantastical, only magnified and focused directly on her. The feel of his skin against hers reverberates across her entire body, though his fingers remain entwined in hers. She looks up at him, caught in the haunting greenish-gray of his eyes again, and she does not turn away. They stand gazing at each other in silence for moments that seem to stretch for hours. The fact that I will never have the time or patience to write under the rules of NaNoWriMo solidifies my respect for those who not only try it, but succeed in it, especially when it results in a book of this caliber. The Night Circus takes full advantage of mankind's fascination with the nocturnal to weave a dazzling magical romance that doubles as a captivating character study of humanity through dreams, and provides an escape which adult readers from all walks of life can run away and join any evening of the week. Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you.